Hello, everyone. My name's Jack Fairweather, and I'm the moderator today. Let me just, it's a little bit uneven. Just let me know if I trail off into the distance. Well, I'm very excited to welcome everyone here and to introduce our very distinguished panelists and to have the chance to discuss Erica's really interesting and important work on perceptions in Afghanistan and how we need to sort of change our views of what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment. So I think, am I introducing everyone now, or is that the way? Okay, well, I think I'd just like to preface my introduction to everyone by saying, as you probably all are aware, David Petraeus introduced a very radically different way of viewing counterinsurgency and viewing our actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the central premise that you need to protect the people, which I think Erica's paper is very interesting in how it challenges the nature of how we are protecting the people in Afghanistan. And I think it raises really challenging questions about our failure to communicate how we are protecting the people in Afghanistan, and that we often think that it's the issue of communication is one for the military to make on Capitol Hill, and I think Erica's paper helps us focus on the way in which we are and aren't communicating our objectives to Afghans. And I suppose at the heart of David Petraeus's concept is the sort of prime agency of the Afghan people, and I think there's great anecdotal and great sort of factual evidence in Erica's work that reminds us of that focus. And to discuss some of these issues, I'm very pleased to introduce Andrew Exum, who I think every war poses its intellectual challenges, and it's always very exciting to see brave young thinkers emerge from some of those challenges and some of those failures. And Andrew is leading the intellectual charge, a former Army Ranger and now working at the Center for New American Security. I worked for the Washington Post in Afghanistan, and I arrived in sort of winter of 2007, early 2008 to discover a large hole in the coalition effort. And I discovered that hole had been filled very admirably by our other speaker, Michael Semple, who's done some, not that he's a very, in a sort of intellectual effort rather than in size of hole. And Michael had been doing fabulous reconciliation work, which I'm really excited to hear and for us all to share in his views on how reconciliation was going and how it's going now. And last and of course centrally is Erica, who I knew in 2008 for doing fabulous work on the campaign for innocent victims in conflict, which I think in many ways sort of got the ball rolling on some of Petraeus and others thinking about changing the focus of counterinsurgency, an organization founded by Marla Razika, who I knew in Iraq, and who lost her life in a suicide bomb there, sort of campaigning for the US military to take account of essentially to count how many victims they were accruing on the civilian side. And Erica sort of took up that work in Afghanistan, and I think this, both Marla's work and her own, are a sort of testimony to to where we stand today. So anyway, without further ado, over to Erica. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this? All right. I should caveat too that I have a co-author on this report and partner in crime who traveled with me to all these places in the research, and that's Jonathan Horowitz, and he's elected not to be in the hot seat, but he's there too for questions afterwards. So the report that we're releasing today is part of a regional policy initiative on Afghanistan and Pakistan. We focus so far on civilian casualties and detention operations, but what we wanted to do for this paper was take a step back from simply documenting issues and take a look at what Afghan communities thought about some of the trends underlying civilian casualties and detention issues. Sort of what do they think the big concerns are, who do they tend to hold responsible, and how do their views line up with what we think or what we hear when we come back to DC or other places. Next slide. So just to kind of set the tone, I think this is maybe what Andrew's going to push back on a little bit. As the introduction said, in the past year, issues like civilian casualties or detention have gotten a lot of attention in the policy communities because they've been seen as central to Afghan attitudes, a central plank of counterinsurgency in terms of winning hearts and minds. As a result, there have been a lot of positive policy changes that have reduced the risk of civilian casualties by international military, and also improve some transparency and due process issues with relate to detentions. So one of the questions we went into this asking were, is this kind of trickling down? Are Afghans picking up on it? Do they feel like their concerns were addressed? Next slide. The other big question that we went into this looking at was not only what do they think about these changes on U.S. policy, but what do they think about insurgent-caused civilian casualties, which are responsible for the bulk of the harm. According to UN statistics for the first half of this year, insurgents were responsible for 76% of civilian deaths and injuries, as compared to 12% by international forces. So it's a huge discrepancy. Insurgents obviously also, beyond deaths or injuries, a lot of what we work on is documenting a lot of pretty gruesome acts, from beheadings or kidnappings or acid attacks or threats or intimidation. So one thing we also really wanted to look at is what are Afghans thinking about, particularly in the last 2 years when they've increased so dramatically? What do they think are solutions to address some of these problems? Next slide. So with those questions in mind, we talked to about 250 civilians, either individual interviews or focus group discussions, in 7 provinces. We started in Kabul, and then we did a really intensive case study in Paktia and Khost, and then we went on to Kandahar, Nangarhar, Herat, and Wardak, and we consulted with a lot of others who had been kind of asking similar related questions in other places we couldn't get to, like Uruzgan or Kunduz or things like that. I do want to be clear, though, we tried to talk to as vast a range as we could in terms of different provinces, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, education levels, but this is not a statistical survey. It's not quantitative research, so please do keep that in mind. It's why we don't offer any statistics, but a lot of anecdotes and quotes in our report. Next slide. So just to dive in there, the first finding that surprised us was the degree to which international forces were blamed equally and often more than insurgents. That, not going to beat a dead horse. Of course, there's been a lot of publicity on anger towards civilian casualties, airstrikes, night raids. A lot. It's been a major issue for Afghans, as well as lingering distrust or anger over past detention practices. So, of course, all of that was part of it. But I think that going into this, we expected there to be at least equal or more blame for insurgents, given what we were talking about, the increase in suicide and IED attacks. And what we often found was, that wasn't the case, that there was still a lot of responsibility towards international forces. We were often surprised that they not only thought they were equally responsible, but they were equally guilty of kind of bad conduct or brutality towards civilians, which did surprise us, because though there have been high numbers of civilian casualties caused by international forces, I think most international lawyers would judge the overall conduct to have been lawful, not the sort of brutality that we've seen on the other side. But we would hear the same accusations of kind of hauling women off in their helicopters and bringing them back dead, or allowing dogs to attack families or dead bodies, or shooting members of families point blank in front of their families, or attacking babies in cribs. Really, really horrific. And what surprised us as well is that this wasn't just coming from people who we thought, might be sympathetic to the Taliban cause or seemed really uninformed or something like that. A lot of them came from, say, a Western, pro-Western, educated human rights worker in Kabul, or we would hear the same things in Herat, a province that's been relatively stable, as with, say, a mullah in Kandahar province, which has seen a lot more of the fighting. So that was one of the first surprising things. Next slide. And then, we kept trying to push and say, but what about the suicide attacks, and what about the IEDs? What do you think's causing them? What's the problem there? And what we started to get, perhaps answers our first puzzle, was that in many cases, the Afghans we spoke to seemed to directly or indirectly hold international forces responsible, not only for their own direct attacks, but also for those of insurgents. Some of the claims ran the flavor of your typical, conspiracy theory. There were a lot of stories of international soldiers giving weapons or supplies directly to the Taliban, or transporting insurgent fighters to previously safe areas, or paying suicide bombers, or even planting mines themselves. We definitely heard a lot of that, again, across the board in about every province. But then a lot of what you have to consider, of course, some of this was related to propaganda or simple mistrust. A lot of Afghans couldn't particularly fathom why international forces could not stop insurgent attacks, and therefore they kind of blamed them for them in many cases. So just to give one example, there was a bomb in Kandahar province in August of 2009 that killed I think approximately 30 to 40 civilians. And it hit no particular target. Nobody could ever figure out, no one particularly claimed the attack, but it was an insurgent attack. And when you go down and talk to folks in Kandahar, the vast majority will say, oh no, that was actually a NATO airstrike, for a couple of reasons. One, they say, well, we know it wasn't the Taliban because they're always really good about claiming their attacks, versus the international forces always deny it. And then secondly, they were like, well, we know it wasn't the Taliban because they always hit their targets. They often also hit other things in the process, but they hit something that makes sense, versus we never know what the international forces are trying to hit. And then thirdly, this gets to the propaganda point. A lot of people said that the Taliban immediately got kind of people on the ground to say, oh no, I saw the NATO planes fly overhead. So it's kind of a confluence of all of these different factors, I think, that's influencing this. Next slide. Now, one thing, though, I do want to be clear about is that in offering these statements, these are general themes we heard from 250 people. That's not to say everyone agreed 100% with each statement. People had very nuanced takes on a lot of these. There were civilians we talked to who said that rumors about international forces planting mines were nothing but propaganda. There were many, who, if not all, who pointed out the really horrific acts by the Taliban and insurgents. But what we found interesting was that if you compare the typical attitudes of where they placed responsibility or causality, it seemed very different from what we would have gone into their thinking, or what we think probably many of us in the audience would have assumed. I think another common, or I should say one pushback I usually get at this point is this kind of, oh, but it is just all propaganda, or so what, these are horrible rumors and perceptions, and what can you do about negative stereotypes? And I do think that you really have to take into account a lot of historical factors, which maybe Michael will speak on a little bit more. You do have to take into account propaganda and basic mistrust. But I think as we pressed in more to these different narratives and we asked Afghans why they believe that, you could see how, even if on first glance the negative accounts seem to be ludicrous or just exaggerated or falsifications, when you really push on them, some of them don't seem that irrational given their experience for the last 9 years. Next slide. So just summing these up quickly, because I do want to get to the other interesting comments. One reason they're not that crazy is, Afghans are right. There have been a lot of harm caused by international forces, directly or indirectly. There have been improvements in the last year, but there are some incidents that go on still, and particularly some of the most offensive actions to Afghans, for example, nighttime house searches, have not only not stopped, but they've increased in the last year. So anytime any of these incidents happen, it kind of reinforces the past perceptions, and it gives these negative accounts or narratives a second life. Second thing to really keep in mind with this is that a lot of the reason probably that these perceptions or narratives have taken on a life of their own or become so dominant in the views of international forces or the international community is that they've been largely allowed to spread without contradiction. That is, for a lot of the last 9 years, the international community hasn't taken a lot of pains to be accountable to Afghans, to be very transparent in explaining their policies or actions. And I think, whether it's simply propaganda or them, drawing their own conclusions, I think that has really allowed a lot of these assumptions to develop. Like with the reductions in harm, there are more measures in terms of transparency now. There's more recognition of harm by international military and compensation, which I worked on, as Jack mentioned, and that's definitely a step. But often there is still public foot dragging in terms of investigations. There is still sometimes the knee-jerk reaction of denials, and that just further exacerbates the weak credibility and the view that international forces are not going to be dealing honestly with Afghans. Third, and this is a really important one that maybe I should have put first, is higher expectations. Again and again, when we asked why Afghans held these views, they would tell us about the initial campaigns in 2001 and 2002, when international forces came into the country and routed the Taliban in a few months without any ground troops. For them, looking at that and looking at the precision weapons that they've seen over the last 9 years, it is unfathomable to them that with 100,000 troops on the ground, we can't stop a Taliban checkpoint outside of Kabul or this insurgent attack. And it's equally unfathomable to them that we can't, that we can distinguish, say, a target, for a drone from the sky, but we can't tell who's a Taliban or a civilian right in front of them. We may have a better understanding of how mistakes happen or where our intelligence isn't so great, but that's their perspective when they're looking at these things. Fourth, just a really quick one, Afghans don't see the insurgency as a monolithic entity, so we tend to lump them together. For example, the UN statistic that insurgents cause 76% of the harm. Odds are, if you're an Afghan on the ground, you attribute this suicide attack to the Taliban, or this one to the Khani network, or this to this. If you actually broke those down and say, 20% to one group, 10% to another, 10% to another, then yeah, the 12% caused by international forces does look about as much to blame as any of the other groups. So that's just a small one. And then finally would be just a little bit more indirectly. I think a lot of times Afghans are suspicious of Western motives or policies given what they know about the partners or proxies they rely on in the region. So while claims that the international military are passing weapons or support to the Taliban or other groups may seem ludicrous to us, there have been incidents where the international media has reported that some members of NATO or their civilian counterparts or subcontractors have passed bribes on to insurgent or militia groups in order to protect aid projects or to ensure security, from that ground that may very well just look like paying off or giving support to the Taliban. Though I certainly don't believe that that U.S. forces try and pass weapons on to the Taliban, we have throughout the last 9 years had a lot of paramilitary or regular forces, local defense or security groups. I hope that we know who we're dealing with in those cases, but the reality is that oftentimes we may not. And given the fluidity of Afghan alliances and affiliations, it's not beyond the realm that some of those groups that we've supported in the past may have had past or present or continuing relations with other militia groups. And then finally, many Afghans who think that international forces support insurgents look no further than Pakistan. Most Afghans believe that Pakistani intelligence are supporting insurgent groups, and they know that the U.S. gives a lot of money to Pakistan. For them, that's enough of a direct correlation. It really brings them back to the 80s, and trying to explain otherwise, I've gotten into many of these debates, it's an uphill challenge. Next slide. Which brings us to the last important point about why these perceptions matter and how. I think I'm hoping to get into this a little more in question and maybe some of the thoughts from my other speakers, but I think a lot of the current policies and exit strategies that we have right now ultimately depend on the cooperation and trust of Afghan communities from the highest to the lowest levels. Everything from counterinsurgency to trying to resolve grievances of groups we want to be reintegrated, to trying to find some sort of honest broker role in reconciliation, to just persuading local Afghans to take the risks that are necessary for improving governance or rule of law. So I think these perceptions, even if some of them may be false or we're skeptical, we do need to look to them and see what is our ownership of them, what policies are exacerbating them or making them worse, what beyond simply strategic communications or spinning things, what are actual policy changes we can make that would counter some of these or would show us to be a more trustworthy partner. Next slide and last. So I just throw up a few recommendations. You all also have the reports. You can go into them more. Some of them relate to, as I mentioned, improving transparency and accountability. Our favorite here is reducing night raids, which we also released another report on. But I think Exum might have some comments on that as well. And we would also, it's particularly related to both accountability, not just in terms of regular forces, which has been improved, but also over special forces and kind of intelligence units that are also involved. I'll kind of stop there because I'm worried about my timing, and let us go on to our next speakers.
So, what do I have?
I think we've got 10 minutes.
Good to see you all. I'm going to do two things.
Michael, can I just ask you to speak into your microphone?
Yep. Do I need to grab it? Is this okay? You got me now? Do you really have to pick it up? I'll pick it up then. Sure. Just a second while I get it. Got it. I'm going to do two things. Offer a few thoughts on the perceptions, and then move on to topic close to my heart, reconciliation. Offer a few thoughts on reconciliation in the light of what we've been looking at on perceptions. The first thing I would say, great work. I'm delighted that you managed to gather this and present it. I think you are supremely wise in not trying to put any percentages to it, because there's so much discredited work out there with completely bogus percentages. But I would say that just about all the things that you've reported back there in terms of perceptions that people have expressed, extremely resonant. This is the discourse that you pick up when you go and spend time talking with and listening to Afghans across the country. Particularly interesting result that you came up with, saying that insofar as you were correlating, there wasn't a correlation with ethnicity. That there was there's massive overlap between the perceptions you had reported, essentially in Pashtuns, non-Pashtuns, insurgency-affected areas, non-insurgency-affected areas, which is a very important result. Because it's so resonant, I just had this long list of anecdotes that I wanted to quote back and saying yes, and this is how it's like. So I could go on all day with those, but a few of them that I thought expressed. I only I only consider one book on Afghanistan worth quoting, which of course is the old favourite 1809 Elphinstone. And the nice thing about this is like a sort of controlled experiment, is that you go that by going back to Elphinstone in 1809, you're able to cut out the colonial exposure, cut out experience of occupying armies, and in Elphinstone's sojourn in Peshawar, staying with the Afghan court, halfway through his stay, a rumor spreads that his Hindu cook has been arrested on the Khyber Pass, heading towards Kabul with a letter from Elphinstone to the rival for the throne, Shah Mahmud, who is in a civil war with Shah Shuja, inviting him to come to Peshawar, capture Shah Shuja and seize the throne. This conspiracy theory spread sufficiently widely that you actually get a crowd gathering waiting for the action to start so that they can loot the guest house and get hold of the belongings. Funnily enough, that the Shah Shuja, the then king, intervenes decisively and says this is a lot of cobswallop. There's no such thing as happening. There was no such cook, and everything's fine, and it's all over. Jump ahead to back to our times, and I was once taken aside by a very senior NATO commander who just said, "Michael, please explain something to me. Why is it that the president tells me that, as far as he's concerned, the most potent threat to the security of Afghanistan is NATO?" And I had to explain that it's something to do with the environment, and it's something to do with the way the president chooses to express these things. But you have a point there. This kind of story, it's not just the president who spreads them. And then the last example I would give is something which I've used as a test of perceptions in Afghanistan. I mean, those of us who've done the longer term human rights documentation are familiar with a story which exists of this dreadful thing referred to as Raqsi Morda, the dance of the dead, which is a tale which is told in Afghanistan of how in the bad old days of the factional conflict of the 90s, the commanders used to get together of a night, they'd get some prisoners, they'd cut off the heads of the prisoners, they'd pour boiling oil on the shoulders, the prisoners would dance around the room before eventually collapsing while the commanders enjoyed themselves watching this. And I would tell this to various Afghans and say, you've all heard this, haven't you? But we as rational human beings know, don't we, that this never could have happened. And then you see what their reaction is. And of course, in my experience, a majority of reaction has been, no, Michael, you don't know what you're talking about. Of course this happened. And I've tried this out to the level of National Security Advisor. And National Security Advisor told, no, Mike, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a silly foreigner. Of course this happened. So, I mean, I think that there are some very important environmental factors that we've got to bear in mind as to driving some of the perceptions. If we were investigating this further, I would like to look at, see if we can get some contrast between elite perceptions and mass perceptions. Because in terms of this, why does it really matter? And it's important that for a policy to succeed, the goodwill, faith, engagement of the Afghan population is important. But I think there's a slightly different significance over the engagement of Afghan elites. And that's why it's interesting to know, where elite perceptions stand. And actually, there probably isn't a very easy answer on this, because some parts of the elite do choose to profess precisely some of those perceptions which you have been describing. And in many other situations elsewhere, what you find is you get a mass perception, you get the elite believes something else and manages to keep things steady while the facts becomes self-abundantly, something different, and then the masses catch up. Whereas I think that what we find in Afghanistan is some of the destabilization that we get, which you've pointed to in a few of your examples, is of course some members of the elite, even right to the top of the government, have actually been fueling the fire by actually spreading precisely those perceptions instead of doing what Shah Shuja did in 1809, which was saying this is nonsense. So yes, I think I think that there's an environmental challenge in the people's receptiveness to some of these stories. That the elite role can be questionable, and we know that a lot of people who've been thinking about why is it so difficult in Afghanistan have been saying that the problems over the strategic partnership between the United States and its key ally in Afghanistan is also making things difficult. But I think we've got to come down to something which is which has been relevant at previous eras in history and is all the more relevant now, is that it's more difficult to sell a strategy which isn't working. And so that, I think I'm very glad that you make it quite clear that your story is not just about perceptions, that when you looked at some of the things, the dreadful things that people believe, actually they're right to believe some of them, because some of these things have not yet been put right, or if they were put right relatively recently. We'd expect a perceptions problem if there are major issues in the strategy, and there are still major issues in the strategy which we can talk about other occasions, which is why I'll shift on to just something about briefly on reconciliation. I've been sort of doing a little bit of thinking, emulating Andrew, on what are we doing there in Afghanistan, what's it all about, and came up with this very strange idea about what if we had a strategy for peace. What if everything that we were doing there was couched in terms of actually promoting peace in Afghanistan? Would things look different? And the reason I asked this question was that I will admit, as somebody who's, I wasn't brought up as a national security specialist, but I grew up working on the ground in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I just find it very difficult to reduce all the legitimate activities and legitimate intent and legitimate engagement of the international community in Afghanistan, including the United States as the biggest element inside the international community, to the war against Al-Qaeda. I just don't think it captures even what are the interests of the United States there. And there are various historical and political reasons why people have to say that's what they're about. But actually, well, I've been thinking about it, saying a strategy for peace seems for me to capture the common interest within which that the very legitimate national security interests of the United States are included, because actually achieving a sustainable peace in Afghanistan is the best way to remove Afghanistan's contribution to the threats to international security, including Al-Qaeda. But of course it is rather more than that. It expresses that this is the yearning of the people of Afghanistan, and also a strategy for peace is something not quite as, in a sense, big and unachievable as nation building, which also some people have talked about. So when I think that it's quite attractive, actually, this idea that what we need is a strategy for peace. It seems to capture what we're not capturing when we reduce it all to this is the fight against Al-Qaeda. It also seems to capture about what we're trying to avert, because I think that some of the new thinking about the Plan B and what do we jump to in December or July or wherever, who've been saying, well, perhaps we can shift over to counterterrorism, who've also been trying to say that perhaps we accept that there's a significant possibility of Afghanistan lapsing back into civil war, and it's okay as long as we retain a counter-terrorist capacity there. I mean, of course, once you accept that what we're doing is pursuing a strategy for peace, makes it absolutely clear, as I believe is the case, that it's totally unacceptable to allow Afghanistan to fall back into civil war, because that is bad for the United States and bad for the people of Afghanistan. But just to say that, oh well, we're sure we could still zap Al-Qaeda even if that happened, I think does not communicate the importance of peace in Afghanistan. So if it's an attractive idea, I mean, of course, I think you'd want to, if you spun it out, you'd want to think of, okay, what would look different if the United States and its allies were pursuing a strategy for peace in Afghanistan, rather than whatever we're doing at the moment, even if it's summed up in the hunt for Al-Qaeda. I think the first thing, the first thing that's sort of relevant for me is we wouldn't feel embarrassed about some form of engagement with insurgents, because it's blindingly obvious. You want peace. Somewhere along the line, somebody's got to be trying to get the insurgents on board with that. It's no longer become, you can come out of the closet, perhaps not even get into trouble for it like I did once. Also, you probably have somebody in charge of taking forward all measures concretely for peace, rather than just assuming that it all adds up towards it. And particularly insofar as you have to have political engagement and mediation, probably somebody would be tasked with it. It would be their job description, that they'd have a staff, they'd be held accountable for how much progress they're making on it. And probably you'd be looking at the resources, and you might even be shifting some resources from the kinetic side towards the active diplomatic work involved in pushing for peace. You'd also ensure that you had you'd be upfront about international responsibility. You would not be able to hide behind the current formulae. So, insofar as people say, yeah, we want reconciliation, we say reconciliation basically is the job of the Afghans. Also, reconciliation means a new accommodation amongst the Afghans. I mean, once you say that what we are trying to do is to promote peace, you'd say that yes, of course, the accommodation amongst Afghans is very important, but there is a strong international interest, and the international community, through whichever vehicles it chooses to use, will be hyper proactive in pursuing this. It also, when you look towards managing the conflict, you probably conclude that we want to de-escalate. And in de-escalate, there's all sorts of ways in which you work out, what tasks the army should have and the approaches that it should use, and you would be giving preference to all those ways of doing business in the army which tend towards de-escalate, which will probably help to create the conditions for peacemaking. You probably have a whole set of public communications around promoting peace and making this mission, which I suspect would sell very well both in Afghanistan and in home countries, the United States and the United States ally. I was in Europe last week, and people were asking me, how can we sell this war? I said, well, why not sell peace? It's rather easy to sell peace than selling war. And I think also there's so many other ways in which the international engagement does business in Afghanistan. We'd be checking their compatibility with peace. So this has been starting to happen tentatively at the moment. So we're looking at incentives that we're creating. We're looking at contracting that we're doing. I think so. This would be done even more enthusiastically. And I think probably we'd come back to issues of justice. It would probably have to be formulated in the right way to make it work. It's not going to be pie in the sky. This is not going to be blind idealism. It's not going to work in Afghanistan. Perhaps that they maybe you'd say after so many years, can we really say that what we're doing is just rule of law? Perhaps we could find something around ideas of natural justice. At least instinctively, where I think we'd be going for is if at the moment we are building up people and investing them as partners and saying this is the way forward, who do have appalling human rights track records, including over the past few years. So at times, while they have been wielding resources which have been supplied by the United States, they have been systematically killing significant numbers of their compatriots in ways that are totally unacceptable and deemed by Afghans as being unjust. We'd probably say we cannot build peace around this, that we've got to go about this in another way. So we would ensure that some principles of natural justice inform the way that we did support to Afghan security actors. So basically, although, of course, there's overlap between what we're doing at the moment and what a strategy for peace would look like, I think it would look significantly different, and it might even work better than what we've got at the moment. And if you want to get perceptions of success in Afghanistan, I think you want to have a viable strategy.
Thanks, Michael. Over to Andrew.
All right, awful tough to follow that. First, allow me to thank Erica for inviting me to participate in this discussion. Erica hails from the same parish in Louisiana as my mother's family, and I will always cherish a dinner at her home in Kabul last year that consisted of Cajun dirty rice and libations more appropriate for New Orleans than the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I take full responsibility for the latter. Second, I'm honored to share the stage with Michael Semple, who has forgotten more about Afghanistan and the conflict there than I have ever learned. So I'm here to learn as much from him as to say anything of consequence myself. And like Michael, I was amused to hear Jack describe me as a brave young thinker. For all non-Americans in the room, I assure you this is the first time anyone has described an East Tennessean as a brave young thinker. The advent of the information age, with the 24-hour cable news program and internet reporters stretched from the Amazon to Zimbabwe, or from Asadabad to Zabul, in our case, with the ability to describe events to the rest of the world in real time, has led to what Colin Gray has described as a constant political and cultural moral audit of military operations that is more often than not a headache for Western commanders, diplomats, and policymakers alike. The conflict in Afghanistan, however, has seen both examples of when this audit has overwhelmed the policy and strategic debates without contributing anything particularly useful. I'm thinking of the 92,000 primary source documents released by WikiLeaks a few months ago. And examples of when the auditor in question has not only raised vital moral and political issues, but has also helped U.S. and allied diplomats and military commanders wage a smarter campaign going forward. Erica Gaston's work for both the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict and the Open Society Institute falls into the latter category. In 2009, Erica's work on the effect of Afghan civilian casualties, the effect they were having on the ability of U.S. and allied militaries to wage their campaign against the Taliban and other insurgent groups, helped lead the commander in Afghanistan, Stan McChrystal, to put in place strict new timelines for the employment of force where Afghan civilians might be present on the battlefield. Erica's ability to convince U.S. and allied military officers that this was not simply a moral question, but also a pragmatic one, was instrumental in realizing tangible change. In the same way, Erica's new report for the Open Society Institute is grounded in both moral and pragmatic concerns about the U.S. and allied mission in Afghanistan. For that reason, I hope it will give U.S. and allied policymakers and implementers as much to think about as her earlier work. Force falls into two categories, brute force and coercive force. The difference between the two is that the latter involves a choice on the part of the object. Brute force is simpler to understand. If I want Jack's wallet and I beat him up to take it, that's an example of brute force. I simply take what I want. The militaries of Western nation states understand and prefer to employ brute force in large part because it plays to our strengths. Destroying an enemy's fighting forces or his industrial base is a task for which Western militaries are particularly well designed. It also, it could go without saying, brute force is easier to understand intellectually. Coercive force is different. If I beat up Michael here with a baseball bat and then threaten Jack that I'm going to do the same thing to Erica if he doesn't give me his wallet, that's an example of coercive force because I'm giving Jack a choice. Weaker actors, such as terrorists and insurgents, better understand and are used to employing coercive force than Western nation states. If Jack were 7 feet tall and 100 pounds heavier, it'd make more sense for me as the weaker actor to threaten to beat up Erica rather than directly challenge Jack with brute force. That's the same logic that explains why insurgent groups use coercive force against large and well-organized nation states. But coercive force has always been employed by Western nation states as well, and even in the most conventional of conflicts. The atomic bomb, for example, despite its destructive power, was used to coerce the Japanese into surrendering at the end of the Second World War. In Afghanistan, coercive force is being used by all sides of the conflict, especially with regard to the Afghan people. Both sides of this binary conflict between the insurgents and the governments of Afghanistan, for example, need the Afghan people to behave in certain ways. And I'm well aware, of course, that the conflict in Afghanistan is perhaps not best described as binary, and that none of the actors on either side could be accurately described as unitary. But one aspect of the conflict is certainly a binary struggle between the government in Kabul and those who aspire to govern in its place, so bear with me here through what I'm about to say. The insurgent, for his part, needs the population to, at the very least, be silent about his activities. If possible, the insurgent wants to convince the population to sympathize with the insurgent cause and to even participate in the insurgent's activities. The population, for its part, is just trying to survive. If left to its own devices, it will survive by ways of passivity, just trying to stay out of the conflict, autarky, which is basically saying a pox on both your houses, I'm out for myself. If you know the character Omar from The Wire, that's a good example of autarky. All the young folks are laughing. Hedging. So, for example, if you have 3 sons, maybe one joins the Taliban, maybe one joins the police, maybe one, goes be a translator for NATO forces, or swinging from side to side. Only if forced to do so will it definitively choose sides, but that's exactly what the government and the counterinsurgent forces are trying to get the population to do. The government wants and indeed needs the population to commit to the government in concrete ways. It needs in Afghanistan, to give it one example, enough Afghans to volunteer for the Afghan National Security Forces. This is why counterinsurgency is necessarily population-centric. And being population-centric isn't about airy-fairy stuff like passing out flowers and candy and never killing anybody. It's about the cold, hard recognition that we and the enemy both need the population to act in certain ways for each to be successful. The insurgent wants to intimidate the population into not cooperating with the government. And we need the population to step forward in large enough numbers to train the kinds of local security forces necessary to defeat a persistent insurgency. The insurgent, by the way, is using coercive force against us as well. The Taliban has no hope of destroying the U.S. Army in the field, a la Akbar Khan over General Elphinstone's army in 1842. Indeed, the Taliban and its allies are instead just trying to kill enough Americans and other Western forces that we abandon the field. As far as the United States and its allies are concerned, then, the insurgent in Afghanistan is using a classic exhaustion strategy, and this is an example of coercive force. I completed my second and final deployment to Afghanistan as a U.S. Army officer in 2004 and did not return until 2009. And by the way, today marks the 10-year anniversary of the commencement of conflict. I spent most of the intervening years studying the conflicts in Lebanon, and especially the 18-year Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon that ended in 2000. And one of the things that struck me while reading Erica's latest report was the similarity between the way we have used force in Afghanistan and the rather clumsy way the Israelis used coercive force in 2 conflagrations in southern Lebanon in 1993 and 1996, respectively. In each instance, the Israelis aimed to coerce the people of southern Lebanon into withdrawing their support for Hezbollah militants via devastating air and artillery campaigns. And from the Israeli perspective, the force they used was selective in nature. After all, they were only bombing those Lebanese communities suspected of supporting Hezbollah. But that's not the way it appeared to the Lebanese. To the Lebanese, the violence appeared indiscriminate. And this is something the armies of nation states get wrong all the time when it comes to coercive force. First, we fail to establish what Stathis Kalibas has called a coherent structure of incentives for non-collaboration. To the population, in other words, it appears as if they're going to get punished no matter who they are or no matter what they do. So they have no incentives to do anything different. This is in direct contrast to the very coherent structure of incentive for collaboration that Erica sketched out that some of the insurgent groups have constructed. Second, we often assume the message we're sending is the one received by the population. In Afghanistan, Erica sketches for us an environment in which our best intentions have failed to be communicated to the Afghans, who, for reasons that go well beyond paranoia and conspiracy theories and into rather legitimate grievances, mistrust the U.S. and allied presence in Afghanistan and our operations there. I told Erica that I was going to keep my remarks deliberately brief because I'm as interested in the conversation that's getting ready to follow as I am in any great pearl of wisdom that I'm about to say. But I hope that what I've provided gives just another additional lens through which we can see some of the dynamics that Erica has described, and yet another successful, if merciless, audit of U.S. and allied operations in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. So thanks very much for your remarks. And I think it probably, in terms of getting the debate going, it would probably be useful to turn to Michael with his sort of deep base of knowledge and possibly just sort of focus on the current surge and sort of ask him what was his sense of how tribal leaders, and I like your distinction between the elites and the people, how you saw what was the reception to the surge? I mean, was this what Afghans were asking for? Did they have a sense of what was coming? And I think that leads on to the question that Erica Reports poses, which is, whether they are able to understand Western application of force on this scale, or whether it's a doomed object. So just to begin with, that sort of initial 2008, 2009 moment, what was your sense of what Afghans were asking for from their Western interlocutors?
Yeah, and I would say that it's always very difficult to grasp these. But
sorry, Michael, if I could just ask you to talk into the mic.
It's very anyway. Yeah, I'm very bad at following instructions, or it's a very weak mic. It's difficult always to grasp these, but I think that one of the consistent messages that I've been getting is that there's, just like on this side of the Atlantic, in the debate, there was a fair amount of skepticism about, will this really work? In Afghanistan, also, many of the local elites in the areas which were going to be on the receiving end of the surge were extremely doubtful that it really would transform the security conditions in their area. They just didn't think it would work. And I think that's something which has been reflected on insurgent side as well, that they expected they would be able to ride it out. Now, quite how if you want to update it to October 2010, that's a slightly different question. I think a lot of them would probably say, well, actually, we were quite right on that. They almost say, where did it happen? There are some particular places where there really has been a very noticeable intensification of operations, but because of a lot of the prevarication over the launching of specific parts of the operation, the long lead in to operations in Kandahar, I think that both tribal elders, local elites who have deliberately, because of exactly the kind of thinking that Andrew's described, have maintained contacts on all sides of the conflict, would probably tend to say, well, we were probably right to doubt that they're not really going to do that much. I think that's I think that, of course, there have been concerns about collateral damage, that that whole thing could turn out very messy. But I think before we've heard about those concerns, I think that we've heard about saying it's not going to work. And so this is where you get the incentives to collaborate or not collaborate, have been the extreme doubts in Afghanistan about what the outcome is.
have we seen, Michael, in the areas that you mentioned where there has been sort of focus activity, the general sense on the US side is that you need the sort of strong stick that Andrew was talking about to coerce the Afghans into reconciliation, or at least those tribes who are aligned against the Afghan government. Have you seen any signs that this sort of hard reconciliation policy is working as it perhaps did in Iraq?
Almost no. And I think the indications of that are, if we look at the sort of the uptake on reintegration, which is meant to be this year's buzzword, key at the really at the forefront of strategy in 2010. Ideas launched by Afghan National Security Council officially in December 2009, headlined in London conference at the start of this year. All the excitement was around that, and then it didn't happen. I mean, in a manner of speaking. Of course, there have been a couple of local examples around Herat, a few people in Shindand who signed up. Some of them who actually I talked to quite a few years ago. But broadly, we haven't seen numbers coming across which you could say that, having done enough beating, you've actually had lots of people coming into reintegration. But if you want to get an explanation of it, the discourse which we've had this year since the December 1st speech associated the surge with a finite period. Although they were very particular, I mean, that you and I know what the president meant when he talked to West Point, and you and I know why he had to say it as well as what he meant. We also know that the way it played out in Afghan perceptions was that the United States was going to use the big stick for a very short period of time. And that seems to have had as much impact on perceptions as any of these operations which people may have seen or heard about, and that the main change in perceptions that you got during 2010 was, even if they launch some operations, they're going to stop them quickly and they're going to draw down. So in terms of this calculation that people are making is, how should I deploy my 3 sons? At the very least, people said, well, there's a fair chance there's going to be some kind of Taliban restoration, so maybe the son I've sent to join the Taliban is the one who's going to get me out of trouble next year. And probably some people have said, well, actually, I mean, if I had a 4th son, I'd probably send him to join the Taliban at the moment. There are major problems in people drawing these conclusions, but if this is a discussion about perception, that's the perception which has been, I think, dominant this year.
I think one of the most challenging things I found in Erica's report was the idea that Afghans are saying that the Petraeus concept of having forward operating bases in villages and having that sort of very close contact between US forces, coalition forces, and Afghans is the recipe for engendering a sense of security and this sort of protect the people motto. That's not coming across and not being felt by Afghans. I wanted to hear a little bit more from Erica about how she had seen on the ground this sort of the nature of US engagement at the village level and why there was this perception among Afghans.
Right. So one of the things we talk about in our report, particularly looking at why international forces might be blamed for insurgent attacks or like suicide bombs or IEDs, a lot of what you get back is, very logically you can understand the sentiment. Well, they wouldn't even had that bomb if international forces hadn't decided to come and camp in my village or pick their convoys through, or whatever. And this, of course, this type of complaint has increased as troops have gone kind of closer to the ground and into more contested areas in particular. Because, for example, after Margin, the operations surrounding there, you had kind of the countryside and the houses absolutely blanketed with IEDs, so that families even that left during the immediate fighting aren't able to go back. There's continuing violence and things like that. So for a lot of the population, it may seem like moving troops closer to the villages, which is not at an insignificant risk to themselves. It is quite a big sacrifice to make as well. That would be perceived warmly by locals because it's seen as putting them there to protect them, when in fact we aren't actually able to protect them, and it actually increases their threat level. That's not viewed as a positive action by them. It's generally viewed as something malign. Maybe that goes a little bit to what you're saying, where it's harder to sell it if it's not working. If that actually were bringing security to these areas, they'd probably love it. But we haven't seen that so far in the last year, so it tends to increase the anger.
And Andrew, maybe you could give us a sense, having worked on McChrystal's original sort of rollout plan for Afghanistan, maybe you can give us a sense of how the US military has been sort of taking on board some of these issues over the past couple of years. And obviously McChrystal was coming at the sort of crest of this wave that was drawing from Iraq experience and taking on board some of Erica and Michael's criticisms. How have you seen the US military adapting in Afghanistan over the last couple of years, and how, and in addressing some of Erica's proposals, how can we sort of align US forces to do a better job?
Yeah, I mean, I guess here's where I'll push back on a couple things. One of the things that the United States, I think, has learned operationally over the past 10 years, and this may be the wrong lesson to have drawn, but it's that high value targeting doesn't have a tremendous effect on insurgent networks. So if you go after, look, I spent a good portion of my early 20s running around the streets of Baghdad trying to get these guys that were on this deck of cards, thinking that this was going to end the conflict in Iraq, and by the end of the day, all we had done is given ourselves a target list that was much larger. When we succeeded in killing Zarqawi in was that 2006, that bought us a grand total of, I think, 18 days of peace in Iraq. When we captured Saddam Hussein in December of 2003, like 3 days later, I was in the worst firefight of my life. Targeting the high value targets doesn't necessarily have the effect on insurgent networks that we desire. However, the caveat to that is that one of the things that we discovered does work is, and there's a unity of command issue here too, because before 2006, in Iraq at least, we kind of had the special operations forces and the general purpose forces doing their own thing, and the coordination between the two got better and better, to where by 2007, one of the things we found did work was going after mid-level insurgent leaders and collapsing. If you look at what the IRA did in 1920 and 1921, going after the British, they focused on what Ahmed Hashim calls infrastructural takedown. So they didn't just go after, soldiers or officers. They went after, they went after civil servants. They were trying to collapse the infrastructure of the state. In the same way, the United States in Iraq, at least in 2007, had tremendous successes collapsing the infrastructure of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that was by going after those mid-level commanders. That's exactly what the United States is trying to do in Afghanistan. The problems are twofold. First off, there's still a unity of command issue. Special operations forces and general purpose forces have been better integrated since really 2009. But, and this isn't, I have no regular access to classified information, most of which I know comes out of the Bob Woodward book. But there are two campaigns going on in Afghanistan, and you don't need to read Bob Woodward's book to know this. There is a U.S. and allied military campaign, and then there is a clandestine campaign being waged by intelligence services. Often those campaigns are, coordination between those two campaigns is almost too much to wish for, but often they actually work at cross purposes to one another. The second thing is that in this report on night raids, I think Erica quite dramatically and effectively portrays the costs of these types of raids, of a special operations raids in Afghanistan. What she isn't able to portray are the benefits of these raids. And so I think that from the perspective of a commander in Afghanistan, he's got to take the costs, which I think are here, but he's also got to outweigh it against the benefits. If the Taliban is struggling to goes through 3 shadow governors of Arghandab district in 5 days, that's a pretty good benefit from the perspective of the campaign against insurgent networks. So that's the one caveat I would say with respect to that. There's costs, but there's also benefits, and getting that balance right. I mean, you have to make the case that whatever the benefits may be, the costs outweigh the benefits. But there's going to be another argument that's going to say, Roger, we've got the costs. We understand what you're telling us. We're not saying any of it's not true. However, here's what we're able to do through these campaigns. With respect to reconciliation, I think, again, I'll go back to Kalivas' Logic of Violence and Civil War, which is a great book. If you look at insurgencies and civil wars, the overwhelming evidence suggests that control leads to collaboration and not vice versa. So the idea that you can start with peace talks, or you can start with, buying off your enemies, or you can start with negotiations, and that's somehow going to lead to a peaceful resolution, the evidence doesn't support that unless security conditions precede those negotiations, or at least run concurrently. The U.S. military thinks of things in phases, and General Petraeus was quoted today as talking about how, hey, it doesn't necessarily work that way, just in Afghanistan at least. Just because you're fighting doesn't mean you can't be talking as well. And I think that's where the military and where the U.S. and its allies are going in Afghanistan. But again, there's this realization that the history of insurgencies and civil wars suggests that you're not going to reach some sort of political reconciliation unless you're able to establish security conditions first. B, one of the things that prevents that from happening is what Michael was talking about, which is when you start putting deadlines on things, we again heard the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense walk back the president's 1 December speech the day that followed before the Congress and say that, hey, look, that's just going to be the beginning of a drawdown. The U.S. commitment to Afghanistan is going to be steady and consistent. That's not the way it was interpreted in Afghanistan. So you're encouraging a lot of the hedging and passivity on behalf of the Afghan population, and kind of the way I was describing it through those deadlines. So that is a complicating factor. I'm not sure that I'd say it's a strategic blunder, because the president also had to both reassure the peoples of troop contributing nations in the West and also remind decision makers in Afghanistan that we're not going to be there forever. But the message that I think was received by the Taliban and by the Afghan people was that we're getting out in July of 2011. And that does not set you up for success when it comes to reconciliation, because as my friend Steve Biddle says, if you're the Taliban, why are you going to accept a loaf of bread when you think the bakery is going to be left unguarded tomorrow?
I could just have a 2-finger in on that. Yeah. Just one quick point, just on the kind of targeted killings and night raids issue. I think the concern is not that, absolutely, if there's, even from a human rights perspective, if it is possible to stop mid-level commanders who are, going to blow up someone the next day, I think that's not something, I don't think anyone would argue that people shouldn't be detained. Certainly, the greater the degree of transparency and due process that can be afforded, for sure. But I don't think that's a point. I think the question is more why, even after entering our 10th year, we haven't found a better way to do it, something that resembles the rule of law more approximately than night raids. Why is that the primary way? Particularly in a year when we've tried to say we're going to do things that encourage better rule of law practices and human rights. We haven't seen that many alternative strategies. Yes, there's probably some times when you can't get that shadow commander going any other way, but a lot of the times when we talk to former detainees or witnesses of a night raid or something, they'll say, I don't understand that was the guy who was in the market selling cassettes every day. Why couldn't they just go to the market and get him in the daytime? And I don't have an answer for them. So that's one. And then the second point, in the cases where you really do need to use that, there's no other way to adequately get the shadow commander. My concern sometimes, and this is less so, you're good to point out the distinction between regular forces and others, particularly when you're talking about intelligence communities or some of the paramilitaries that they use, again, citing to Woodward's book. When you're talking about them, are they making that cost-benefit calculation? Because my concern is sometimes that they are just focused on the counterterrorism without thinking about the broader political or human rights ramifications.
Right, or do they have, or their systems of accountability set up?
Right.
We've just witnessed the horrific murders that were perpetrated by a striker unit in Kandahar province. But the good news about the military is that there are systems of accountability set up, and in all likelihood, those soldiers are going to be spending a lot of time at Fort Leavenworth, and I'm not talking about the Command and General Staff College. I mean, there'll at least be some sort of judicial punishment. On the flip side of that, once you switch over to kind of the dark side of things, I mean, again, this is not I'm not the pros pro on this, but I wonder if there are similar ways of accountability and responsibility. The second thing, one thing you point out is that even in cases where you decide that, yes, these types of raids are necessary, you can still take the recommendations in your reports and others and figure out ways to mitigate some of the costs that you talk about, ways to maybe do things differently. And I think that, with respect to high-value targeting or special operations forces, it's still very much a learning process. But, I mean, I do... a little experience in those units. They are units that are quite willing to learn, to learn tactically and operationally, if not strategically. That's a different matter. So, thank you,
Michael. I wanted to have a sense from you in talking to tribal leaders, to the Taliban, as you have done. One of the things that comes across in Erica's report is the fact that the night raids, the operations are not being adequately communicated. Is it possible? How would your average tribal leader respond to an explanation, greater transparency that Erica is calling for?
Generally, what you hear from tribal elders, local elites, is that, as Erica's suggesting, that there are alternative ways of achieving most of these objectives. Particularly the story they tell is that, they make a distinction between insurgents who are acting covertly and are sort of highly mobile and are temporarily there, as opposed to people who are living inside the community, and somebody has decided that they are also involved in the insurgency. They're a target. Basically, what tribal elders tend to say is that those people who are there are part of the community. We can bring them in. There is a concept in Afghanistan called jalb, which is basically summons. He said, use some summonses. That the negative consequences of summonses are far less than the negative consequences of these surprise raids. Particularly bearing in mind that we know that even where people are picked up and detained, many of them essentially are released because it's concluded that they're not actually of much value, and they certainly don't don't need a custodial sentence or something like that. So basically, the Afghans say that as far as possible, use local processes which essentially tend to preserve honor, while also recognizing that that there is a security or law and order process that's got to be pursued. There's one other direction I thought we could also sort of take the discussion on perceptions. I think we perhaps haven't touched on it yet, which is insurgent perceptions and insurgent communications of the war that they're fighting, and it goes on to Andrew's talk about this, like the search for the binary conflicts, because it seems very relevant to me that the insurgents are incredibly insistent that they are engaged in a fight between the insurgents and NATO. I mean, hardly ever do you find any reference in their communications or the word they put out to even acknowledging that they're fighting against the Afghan government. If you ask them about the Afghan government, it's always a puppet, it doesn't matter, the Americans run everything. And when you ask them who you're fighting, they don't admit they're fighting the Afghan government. And it's not an empirical issue. They assert, no, it's us fighting against NATO, because they believe it's glorious to fight against NATO. They believe that they can motivate young men to go out and fight against NATO. I mean, you talk to, you talk to some of the kids who actually are doing the fighting. I mean, maybe in reality, most of the clashes they've been involved in have been with the Afghan police, who do take tremendous casualties. But the stories that they choose to tell, all the stories that they choose to tell, are of them fighting NATO, even at times when they've been beaten. I mean, all this thing about in every tactical encounter, of course they get beaten. It's only every now and then when they have an IED that they can sometimes do. Anyway, it's. I think that some of them genuinely perceive that. Perhaps there are some people who are orchestrating things, who believe something else, or involved in an Afghan power struggle, but choose to communicate this. I think then it becomes very relevant to those who are not actually active insurgents, but again, non-committed members of the community who can jump either way, who've got 3 or 4 sons to allocate amongst the different actors. What's their perception? Do they believe that it's a fight between the young men and NATO, or do they actually believe that it's a fight between the Afghan government and the insurgents, with NATO helping out? Because I think here we get an incredible gap in perceptions between the sort of war that essentially that our governments tell our people that we're fighting, and what the Afghans are describing, because to some extent in the US you can get out saying we are fighting a war against the Taliban because of this. But I mean, in Europe, and particularly in Europe, people are very reluctant to say that. I mean, we're helping the Afghan government secure its country, and helping the Afghan government fight against the Taliban. But it's not there in the stories that the Afghans tell.
That's a very good point. How do you see, to Michael and Andrew, the President Karzai, the Afghan leadership, being able to fill this sort of this gap? You in your very earlier remarks, you described how there wasn't necessarily the Afghan leadership to sort of present to sort of the anecdote from the 19th century you recounted. We're not having someone there who's sort of telling it like it is. And where do you see that coming from? How do you see what can Karzai do to change it?
Yeah, I think that this is not an issue of capacity, that the Afghan leadership is not able to do it. I think that it's a decision. I think that to get this, I think you have to understand the sense that the President Karzai's political personality, and I think that he personally does not like the idea of waging war against a section of his people. I think that's a very personal, emotional thing. And I think as a politician, he has decided that he does not want to project himself as a war president. I think that actually he's comfortable with, given that there's a war on, he is more comfortable with NATO being projected as fighting that war. And I think he'd far rather sort of play the good cop. And I think this probably runs very counter to some of the advice that he was given when he visited this city, which was, take responsibility for this war, show sovereign responsibility. And we can see in the background the sort of the leaked cable from the ambassador talking about sovereign responsibility. I think that this is a very real issue, and I think it directly contributes to these perceptions that we're talking about and the perception gap. I think it is a problem, but it's not something which either hasn't occurred to him or that he's not capable of. He has taken a political decision which is probably influenced by some personal compulsions, and his decision is to say, let NATO fight the war and let me try and do the politics, keeping a high degree of distance from the war, and let me not be thought of as a leader who is killing Pashtuns.
Yeah, I would add to that only briefly to say that I think we have to be open to the real possibility that Hamid Karzai honestly feels that we're fighting the wrong war, that we're fighting a war in southern Afghanistan when the war we should be fighting, we being the United States and our allies, lies across the Durand Line. And that's where he sees the problem originating from. He's uncomfortable, I think, as Michael said, waging a war against his own people.
I'd like to just ask Erica about some of her solutions before turning the panel over to the audience. And there were 2 very concrete solutions that Erica suggested. One being a sort of transitional justice mechanism that Michael also touched upon, and also a national registry of victims. And I suppose I was interested, having done all this on-the-ground research, in proposing these ideas to Western officials and the military. Clearly, Afghans would like greater transparency. How were these ideas received by the NATO officials that you were speaking to? And then going on to a slightly broader point, if we're moving towards the end of the sort of short, sharp push, slightly longer than planned, how does what Eric is suggesting fit into a sort of transition policy and a sort of post-surge reality for Afghanistan? But to Erica, first of all.
Yeah, just briefly, we did recommend that when thinking about any longer-term solution, I think this kind of goes into what Michael was talking about when you're trying to think about designing sustainable peace. You also have to think about transitional justice, that to the degree that some of the perceptions or the anger or the rivalries or fighting that's going on in Afghanistan now is a residue of the last 9 years, and also the years of conflict before that there has to sort of be a direct recognition of that and a sense of justice and getting it out in the open, I think, in order for Afghans to really move on and start to resolve their differences. And so I think that's an important component in any proposals for reconciliation or longer stabilization process. And one idea that I think is something that those in a position like myself in civil society, particularly Afghan institutions, might contribute would be by creating a more open and public registry, such as we've seen in other transitional processes in other countries, such as South Africa or others, that took the time to document what happened in terms of how NATO would receive that. The body counting, as it's more crudely referred to, is always a contentious debate, and I imagine that something like that would also get mired in it, because and with some reason, it's very difficult in Afghanistan, given that a lot of these incidents happen in rural, insecure areas, to find out exactly what happened in any given engagement, particularly the difficulties of access. Bodies are often buried within 24 hours. So I think all of those would be complexities that would have to be worked out for sure.
And Andrew, just in conclusion, how do you see a sort of a movement away from surge to transition strategy? How is that going to affect perceptions? How should that be communicated, both in Afghanistan and in
I mean, Yogi Berra said that you should never make predictions, especially about the future. But having said that, if I were to make a prediction, I would say that the dynamic that Erica described in this report is going to get worse and not better. There's a sign in a yard in my neighborhood in D.C. that says "End the war in Afghanistan." And of course, what it really means is U.S. get out of Afghanistan. It doesn't mean end the war in Afghanistan. I think that, what I worry about, I think there's going to be a debate over the next few months about how fast you can prudently draw down to something that looks like security force assistance and a more limited counter-terror mission in Afghanistan. Because from the perspective of U.S. interests, a long-term resource and time-intensive counterinsurgency campaign is just a strategic loser for U.S. interests. Switching to a more limited counter-terror campaign in Afghanistan with security force assistance as well, I think means prolonged civil war for the Afghans themselves, and I think a proliferation of some of the more heavy-handed tactics that Erica has described as having alienated a lot of the Afghan people. So, again, what may be best in terms of U.S. interests, and may not be the best thing in terms of for the Afghan people. So I'm a bit of a pessimist about the conflict.
Well, on that cheery note,
they call me Sunshine at the office.
Any questions from the audience from our panel? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you. Talking about Afghan perception, I happen to be from Afghanistan, and I want to thank you for the report. It's a very valuable report. I cannot disagree with the recommendations. I just wanted to caution you on one item, one issue, and that is that obviously, as discuss anecdotes, do not represent the entirety of the population in Afghanistan. I think that I can also sit here all day and list a very long list of anecdotes, stories throughout the country. And there's a danger in overextending certain opinions, anecdotes from one village or the other village to the overall issue. That has been done before. The real underlying story is that despite the challenges and difficulties of the past 9 years, incredibly enough, the Afghans, as far as I can understand it, still want the international community to help them out in rebuilding their country because they have seen so many challenges and difficulties. So I think Michael mentioned that, and he's correct, that the Afghan elite and others in NATO have used one of these stories to create another kind of perception. So that's one thing I want to really caution you about in overextending yourself in there. And the other thing is, I think that in Afghan perception, the reasons why they're skeptical about the international community are not just couched on just the past few years. There is a very long historic reality to this that I think was somewhat missing in the report. Not going back to the English wars, but the Soviet Union withdrew in '89. What did the international community do? Basically abandon Afghanistan. In 2001, we went back there, and then we sort of abandoned them by going in Iraq. In 9 years of this period, there has been almost no real reconstruction efforts in the South, and despite the fact that Afghans are illiterate, in those villages in the South and in the North and everywhere, people listen to the radio. And what do they hear? They hear the BBC. So you mentioned the perception of expectations. Everybody's telling me that billions of dollars are being poured in. They don't see that. Obviously, they want a lot more. So the real story is not one of action in Afghanistan. It's one of inaction. The past year or so of the counterinsurgency strategy is very new. The real story is that almost nothing has been done to turn around the Afghan people, and the first face that you see is the boots. So I just wanted to mention that to you if you want to comment on it. Thanks.
Yeah, just a quick comment. You're absolutely right about one thing that we asked many questions when we went around and talked to communities, and we only focused on a small range of them in this report just to keep it very narrow and concise. But we did often ask as well, you've expressed all of these negative opinions. What do you think? Do you think international forces should leave? And overwhelmingly also, they would say, no, we really don't want to be abandoned. So I think you're absolutely right about that. There is a lot of hostility and anger, but there is still a willingness or a want to work with the international community. And I do think also, you're absolutely right about the expectations as well. We also found, despite that a lot of people would, when we try and raise some of these concerns with policy officials, sometimes we'll get the response that Afghans are not informed, or they're, you're right, they do. They listen to the radio. They know what, and that has created a lot of expectations. I think they expected more at this point, and that's also an important point of their perspective on this.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, you, sir.
Hello, thank you. I'm Scott Worden from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thanks for the great report and the great presentation. I just wanted to maybe press on two issues that have already been raised. One, in terms of the special forces or the other government agency element of this, it's frustrating kind of observing the situation in Afghanistan for several years now. It seems like a lot of the worst abuses do in fact come down to that half of the equation. And the Woodward book, among others, has emphasized that the size of these other non-military forces might be even far larger than we had anticipated. I just wonder, is there any way to assess what percentage of the negative consequences are caused by that? And the point's well taken that we don't necessarily see advertised, or we can't see advertised the benefits, but how much of this, how much energy are we wasting effectively in reforming the whole military structure, I think, in a very positive direction when it's undermined by this other government agency element. And then the second point, if I may, that I wanted to touch on was the justice issue and the rule of law issue. And Michael, I mean, I think that you well phrased it. If you think about a policy for peace or a plan for peace, justice has to be at the core of that. On the other hand, I think that there's, for example, the Washington Post article about Colonel Razik the other day. I mean, there's this literally, quote, Afghan good enough model. If they're not actually caught red-handed, in highway robbery, then that's acceptable. I wonder if I can invite some comments on, where do we have to draw lines on our own behavior, on our own messaging and support to have a justice-centric approach or to improve that part of the process?
Well, yes.
Sorry. Just really quick on the first question. You're right that a lot of at least when I or my colleague Jonathan are trying to follow up on incidents of abuse where there's still outstanding problems, and it looks like internationals are involved. Again, one of the problems is there's so little transparency over particularly intelligence units or any paramilitaries affiliated with them, and stepping back also sometimes from special forces. So it's really difficult to tell with those actors exactly who's involved, and that makes it difficult to estimate the percentage. But my understanding is that most of the kinetic operations are being conducted by this category. So you're right to an extent, and I think we also feel the frustration sometimes. So many improvements have been made and a lot of progress, and sometimes we feel a little bit guilty talking to those guys again and again about these problems, realizing that it's the guy in the back actually that's still doing it. So I do think there's a real tension within that, which maybe Andrew would want to speak on more, between having sort of this counterterrorism strategy within the counterinsurgency, such that you're often undermining your own strategic goals or moral or human rights commitments with this one part of it.
I mean, direct action special operations can be a tremendous benefit to a counterinsurgency strategy if properly integrated. The problem is when you don't have unity of command, you're unlikely to have unity of effort, much less any type of operational coordination. So I think it's just a unity of command issue, and there you get to just basic, principles of war. This is not graduate level warfare. This is the very basic stuff that we're screwing up.
Yes.
If that was transformed in Iraq, as you were saying, do you see any seeds for that being transformed here?
No, because if you look at the NATO commander in Afghanistan, and I saw Stan McChrystal deal with this on a daily basis. His writ extends only to the borders of Afghanistan. If you have a problem of not just insurgent safe havens, but also transnational terror groups in another country, then you also have to have some sort of operations to keep those insurgent groups or those transnational terror groups off balance. Unless you want to extend the NATO writ to incorporate another country in the region, which I don't think that's ever going to fly, because that other country in the region is a steadfast and loyal partner of the United States and its NATO allies. You're not going to see unity of command anytime soon. So no, I don't think. Again, I'm not hopeful in that regard.
Michael, do you want to address the second part on justice?
Yes, I'm glad you raised the issue, Scott. You raised the issue of Abdul Razik, who's a border police commander down in particularly focusing in the Rodak district in Kandahar, although he's been popping up in several other districts recently. I think that now that some people have been trying to propose him as a good enough commander, you actually get a test case of which way justice should be taking the argument. I personally believe that this good enough argument is disingenuous. Because we've been told for 9 years now that the compulsions of security pull in a totally different direction from the compulsions of justice. I just think it's empirically wrong, and I think that you can show that it's empirically wrong. It'd be nice to get some more empirics on it, and that's why I was using this phrase of natural justice, to give an idea that this is talking about the way the people see it, rather than just the way that the lawyers see it. We know that in terms of, if you let the lawyers loose on Abdul Razak, he'd be locked up for an awful long time. Because he's been investigated. All the evidence is there on file. He could be serving many years for the things which the Afghan police investigations have demonstrated that he has done. But instead, of course, he's been protected. I believe that offends the sense of natural justice of many of the Afghans in the areas where he is active, and that has been a factor which has been seriously fueling the insurgency, and that the actual reason that actors like that are being backed, are to do with building of alliances and patronage and loyalty and so on, and it is not to do with an overall security assessment. I think in this case you can see that concerns for natural justice actually pull the same direction as security.
Thanks. Next question. It's back row here. No, it's not. Michael.
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jason Stern. I'm a student at George Washington University, and my question is pretty simple. It's, who is the counterinsurgent in Afghanistan? Is it the international forces, in which case, obviously, a question of trust deficit is essential between the international forces and the Afghans? Or is it the Afghan government, in which case, why aren't we looking at the trust deficit between the government and the Afghan people? Or is it, in fact, both the government and international forces? Then why aren't we also looking at the deficit of trust between the government and international forces, in addition to deficit of trust between government and Afghan people? Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to take that?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I mean, we're not waging a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. The president basically said no in December 1st, 2009. He banned the word counterinsurgency and the word counterterrorism from any discussion. And if you saw the goals that were articulated in March of 2009, I mean, I think it's completely reasonable to read the president's policy and his strategic goals and to assume, right, the president wants a resource-intensive, population-centric counterinsurgency strategy, because all those goals are describing such a strategy. By the time we get to December 1st, 2009, I think some of the underlying assumptions had been questioned. We were coming off a relatively disastrous presidential election, and you also had the McChrystal assessment, which was gloomy to say the least. And the president, I think, made very clear that the United States military should do those operations that lead to the transition of security responsibility to Afghan forces. Okay, that's something different than counterinsurgency. And matter of fact, he put a time limit on it. He said, and by 18 months from now, we need to be getting out. So if you want to do counterinsurgency operations to buy time and space to train Afghan security forces, knock yourself out. But there's going to be a time limit on that, and at some point I'm going to expect us to be able to transition over to security force assistance. The issue the United States habitually has with counterinsurgency is that, except when Southerners like myself get ornery, we almost always wage counterinsurgency campaigns on behalf of a host nation and as a third party. And the researcher Aaron Simpson, who's over there in Afghanistan now and just turned in her dissertation at Harvard in between tours over in Afghanistan, if you look at her dissertation, she codes out pretty clearly success rates in counterinsurgencies. It doesn't matter. Regime type, ultimately, it doesn't matter that much. Whether you're a democracy or autocracy, whatever. Your success rates more or less stay the same. However, waging a counterinsurgency as a third party or as the host nation, your success rates radically go down if the former is the case. And I think what Michael described is that the former is indeed the case. President Karzai's, look, this is not his conflict. And as a matter of fact, I think there's a part of him that genuinely believes, again, that we're waging the wrong conflict in Afghanistan. Instead, we're waging counterinsurgency and kinetic and non-kinetic operations against his natural constituency in southern Afghanistan rather than against where he thinks the problem is, which is the safe havens in Pakistan.
Next question. Yes, back left.
Seema Ahmad. I work here at OSI on domestic national security issues. One thing that we haven't talked about directly is religion and perceptions toward religion. And I'm curious, Erica, kind of keeping in mind, I think, the important cautionary tale about broad generalizations, whether or not there's traction in the idea that America is at war with Islam and that Americans sort of inherently don't value Muslim lives, and what that sentiment might mean for everything sort of the panelists have said about how we articulate the conflict, how we articulate who the various actors are, Karzai's interests given that dynamic, and what the religious perceptions mean for a successful strategy in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, this was definitely something that came up. You know, a lot of the anecdotes of bad behavior did relate to offending religious beliefs, even some that, you know, very much could have happened that it wouldn't have occurred to. For example, there were a couple elders that were very angry because I guess some local troops had been kicking around a soccer ball that had the flags of different countries, including a country that has a picture of the Quran on it. So it was viewed as kicking the Quran. You know, so even simple. That's a very simple example to other behavior that they viewed, whether, you know, seeing women or attacks against particular religious figures, or even if you see incidents like the recent threat to do the Quran burning. I mean, incredibly offensive. So I do think there's an element of that tinges these perceptions as well.
Michael, do you have something to add on perception of religion and its role in the conflict?
I'd add that it's useful to look at, again, sort of some distinctions between perceptions in general population. Again, the man with his sort of 3 or 4 sons, and perceptions inside the insurgency, and those perceptions that insurgents tend to try to cultivate, what they communicate. It's very clear when I look at what insurgents choose to communicate, and I think probably what many of them choose to believe, is that they believe they're fighting a religious war. They believe that if you look at what grand title does Siraj Haqqani give himself? It's Khadimul Din. He's serving the religion. And all insurgents try to portray themselves as defending the religion, implication that somebody's attacking it. I think that the reason that it's correct that that across much of Afghanistan, much of the population still wants United States, international community to help prop up the current order, is that probably a majority of the population hasn't bought into that agenda, except for at times when there is a particular controversy. There's a lot of acute sensitivity, but overall, the majority of the population does not buy the idea that America is at war with Islam. However, that's what the insurgents are trying to persuade people of.
Next question, front row.
I want to return to this topic of our reliance on proxies with an abusive track record, or at least they're perceived that way. One of the questions I have is whether or not we can have this type of presence we have in Afghanistan without relying on such proxies. I mean, if you look at how we move goods in the country, how we guard our bases, how we buy concrete, how we're building the Afghan security forces, et cetera, I mean, all of that's happening essentially through proxies, most of whom do not have particularly good track records. So if I agree with you that we need to stop empowering these people, but what does that mean for what type of force posture we need to have in the country?
Erica or Andrew on that one? Maybe
I could go a quick answer. It doesn't just depend upon the character reference. It determines about what happens when something goes wrong. If somebody who's been empowered as a proxy, whether that means he may be uniformed person inside the Afghan National Security Forces, or he may be somebody who's shifting goods around or protecting those goods, but not actually uniformed security. If he arbitrarily arrests 17 people and takes them, to the mountainside and kills them in firing squad, then he gets arrested and detained, and he's no longer used as a proxy. So it's not a question of, are we just going to find good, God-fearing Afghans and only work with them? It's a question of, in everything that you do, and the stuff which is done through the international side and the stuff which is done through the Afghans, it actually's got some accountability.
This front right here, please.
My name is Alana Corsi, and I'm with Karis Associates. In the side presentation, at the very end, you have a list of recommendations, and one of them was about when it was, or that it wasn't necessarily a good idea to arm maybe local militias, or not entirely sure how you want to define that. My question is, when is it appropriate to train, supply, or arm local Afghan police units? So not like the regular Afghan police or the regular Afghan armed forces, but these kind of more local at the village level.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When we were referring to, there have been, one of the persistent problems, this is sort of back to some of the proxy issues. A lot of the issues of abuse have come not necessarily from internationals directly, but from the local forces that they've empowered. So sometimes that comes in the form of sort of paramilitary force enablers, for example, with intelligence forces, or sometimes that comes in the form of what's sometimes been called auxiliary police, or local defense initiatives are now Afghan local police. It may be in some cases that these groups are no better than their local Afghan police commander, but often what the problem in the past has been is that because they're irregular militias, and as Michael just pointed out, they have no accountability mechanisms at all, kind of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. They then tend to commit abuses of power against the population, are not held to account, arguably undermine many of the goals that they were created for, often just tends to be a nasty situation. So I think the key is when you're trying to develop a criteria for how you're going to be empowering local forces, this relates either to any degree of ANSF forces or local militias, is ensuring that there's effective accountability structures for them.
Okay, final question. This gentleman in the back.
Brian Jolkowski from Mercy Corps, and I guess this is a question for both Andrew and Michael. There seems to be a certain amount of tension between Michael's vision of kind of pursuing a strategy of peace, which would include de-escalation, I guess, and Andrew's analysis of when it's appropriate to pursue reconciliation. And I guess in particular, Michael, if you could kind of extend how you see a strategy of peace kind of resolving that tension of needing to have some kind of incentive for the insurgents to actually stop fighting, but also the need to provide security for the population, and what it means, to kind of have that strategy of peace from a security perspective.
Thanks, Brian. Actually, I was listening very carefully to what Andrew was saying to check that we are on the same script, and I think we are, because I was because I believe that one of the sort of fundamental ways of ensuring that that there are incentives for the insurgents to move beyond armed struggle is it should be absolutely clear to them that ride out doesn't work. That however long they try to ride out, that they are not going to be able to overrun Kabul, topple the system, grab the bakery. I think that is absolutely fundamental, and in a very, Andrew made the point, very coherent. It's good. The idea of having a strategy for peace, ironically, it's not a pacifist prescription in the sense of renouncing, the use of violence or the use of security measures. It's about being clear about what we want to achieve and making sure that all components of the strategy work towards it. But you do have to have a robust element to it. But it's the de-escalation. You can de-escalate and still make it clear that the insurgents don't get the bakery tomorrow. But the thing about de-escalation is it's likely to help rebuild some of the shattered confidence, which creates the conditions for a political process where Afghans might actually be able to agree amongst themselves and with us.
Andrew?
Yeah, I'm sitting next to the person who literally wrote the book on reconciliation in Afghanistan, so I'm pleased that we don't have a disagreement, because then we'd have an issue. I actually want to quote the eminent expert Michael Semple, and something that he said once that I quite liked, which is that the Taliban is fighting a civil war that they can't win. And I think that's very true. I mean, even if the United States withdraws tomorrow, the strategic outlook for the Taliban does not look very good in Afghanistan, because our withdrawal isn't going to be a collapse. Even if I unfortunately think that we're looking towards many more years of civil conflict in Afghanistan, but I don't think the strategic outlook looks very good for either the Pakistanis or their proxies in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, everyone. If we could give a round of applause to our panel. Great, and thank you very much.